Okay, let's continue our discussion of the education of Augie Merasty. Chapter 8 is entitled Le Pain, and if you remember earlier, Augie talked about Brother Le Pain as somebody who continually, the memories of this man haunt Augie even into his 80s. He still thinks about this one person. So this is the chapter that tells us why uh, Brother LePain has stuck in Augie's mind for all of the actions, the abuse that Augie was forced to endure as a child. Um, so he talks in the opening of chapter 8. He says, "Some time ago, I submitted my accounts of what Brother LePain did to me and to some of my schoolmates." So that's where he's acknowledging that he submitted these testimonies of what happened to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was, part of the process of the TRC Commission was to accumulate all these testimonies from survivors who experienced residential schools firsthand and what they went through. So Augie submitted those stories as part of that process. So he's talking about things that happened to him when he was around 8 to 12 years old. And he says, "I have not been able to remember everything from that time, but I remember more than enough." So, he's an old man at this time. So there are things that maybe he can't remember exactly everything that happened, but these were the moments that he seems to have stuck in his mind. He talks about his friend, Shorty Joseph, who he acknowledges is now deceased. And yeah, we get these little glimpses like this one where, he acknowledges all these people who he's known and they're no longer alive. And we can't tell whether it's from old age or whether they, died from other circumstances. But we can acknowledge that, a lot of his contemporaries, his peers who he grew up with are no longer alive. And many of those ones who had died um, were inflicted, suffered from abuse as children. And so we can make an association between maybe the abuse that they experienced as children and then um, what imagine what their lives were following that, and how it maybe took a toll on their well-being long after those events were over. Shorty Joseph, his friend, was one of the targets of Brother LePain, and Augie talks about how Shorty Joseph was abused by LePain, and uh, he knows that he was abused because he himself was abused by Brother LePain. So he knows that it wasn't just himself, but others who were also victims of this one man's sexual abuse. Augie talks about Brother LePain on page 46 and describes how, at first he was treated well by Brother LePain, but this was when he first entered the school. He was underage, so he was only 5 years old and 8 months when he entered the school. And it wasn't until he turned 6 that Brother LePain started treating him as he treated the other students, which was very inhumanely, punishing them very harshly. And Augie acknowledges that he was waiting for Augie to become school age, 6 years old, and then he could do accordingly what he wanted to the children under the strict rules of the Catholic hierarchy. So until Augie turned 6, he was kind of protected by his youth, his young, and his smallness, that he was the youngest and smallest of the 55 boys at the school. He describes Br'er LePain's appearance as being kind of reminiscent of an eagle. And he talks about being under Br'er LePain's eagle eyes. And his eyes and nose, they both reminded me of an eagle. So I think the animal imagery there is used kind of strategically, talking about somebody with eagle eyes. is a way to acknowledge how they were very, they're always scrutinizing you, always sort of looking and looking for you to do something wrong. So this is probably part of his perception of this man as like an eagle. So he was always looking at the boys, always looking for any kind of little offense that he could punish. So that was part of his like eagle-like scrutiny of the children. And then his particularly cruel, he would come down on the children like an eagle would its prey, and inflict his punishment, which is particularly harsh. He would bring out a corrugated 3-foot garden hose and beat the children for any kind of um, indiscretion or any kind of minor little thing they did wrong. So the children were beaten if they made any what he called dirty noises, which was farting, if they were giggling, if they laughed or smirked at that, they would get beaten across their bodies by this corrugated garden hose. And it seems as if, if he couldn't make the boys scream, he would continue beating them and then bring out this corrugated hose until they would scream. So it does give a sense like almost that there is this kind of sadistic element of pleasure that, Brother LePain and the other instructors, or whatever you want to call them, the administrators, authorities, they got some sort of pleasure or felt more powerful by inflicting pain and beatings on the children. And it's sort of this sick kind of almost pathological depiction of these, authority figures who were, getting off on their show of punishing the children. And Brother LePain, if he caught anybody whispering, smiling during silence time, lining up for church, anything like that, he would punch, hit the boys if they were out of line, or if they were doing anything that he perceived as even if it was a minor offense, he would beat them for that. Augie talks about being sexually abused by Brother LePain, and he talks about being a child, 8 years old at the time, and then being in the washroom and having Brother LePain force him into a sexual act that he screamed and tried to run away, and he was threatened by Brother LePain if he ever said anything about it. So Augie's just a child when this happens to him, but it's clear that this incident has greatly impacted his mental health, and it still sticks with him that this happened to him, and it's obviously a very traumatic event that happened to him. So when he's abused, he says, "I started screaming as if someone was trying to kill me. He held his hand over my mouth and almost choked me with his other hand and told me if he would give me a beating with the 3-foot garden hose if I ever told anyone." LePain also drags him across the floor and threatens to throw him out the window, but Augie breaks loose and runs outside. But even he talks about every day after that, every morning, Augie would be forced to lie on his belly on the bed, and then Brother LePain would beat them with this corrugated garden hose. And he says, "I figure I got at least 500 to 600 beatings with that hose." And the beatings he acknowledges as a kind of way to keep those boys, there were 6 other boys along with himself, silent about the sexual abuse that they experienced. And he says, "I figure now that the reason he did what he did to me, all those whippings, was to keep my mouth shut about that sexual abuse. He did a good job because I never told anyone about those assaults until now. They were too painful and shameful to me, and I would have been the laughing stock for everyone, even to this day. So he does acknowledge that there's a kind of a stigma that some victims of sexual abuse might feel coming forward with that painful, traumatic experience. And, it takes a lot of courage for somebody to come forward and talk about abuse. And I think, it tells us how strong and courageous Augie is for writing about his experience of sexual abuse, and how, he felt pain and shameful about it. And he feared that his friends and family, his community would laugh at him if he came forward. And I do think that possibly that maybe, I don't want to generalize, but maybe men who are victims of sexual abuse or assault maybe feel a kind of stigma or sense of shame for coming forward, just because, it places them as kind of a victim, as a sexual object of other men. And this would be something maybe that would also compromise, or they feel it would compromise their masculinity in some way. But I do think that there's this kind of barrier that Augie faces when he comes forward with this information about what happened to him, and it places him as a hero, as somebody who's courageous for coming forward. And I think you really have to just acknowledge that, that barrier that he had to cross in order to share these stories uh, as a survivor of what he went through. And he talks about other boys he knew who also um, experienced the same thing as he did, and some of them didn't survive, some of them continue to have nightmares. He says these boys have all grown up with these nightmares, but only one of them is still alive. So he kind of acknowledges the fact that, victims of abuse often, have, long-lasting psychological symptoms because of what they endured, maybe even when they were, 8 years old. Something like that can affect you for many years, even decades after that's over. And, it's a long process of overcoming something like that that you experience as a child. And Augie survived it, and he's come forward to tell his story, and he acknowledges that many people aren't alive who, his peers, his friends who also experienced abuse. They don't have the chance to tell their stories now, but he's still alive. He's a survivor, and he's sort of sharing his story in a way for all those other students who maybe didn't get the chance to share their truth. Uh, so it's really an important part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is to share these stories that have been silenced for so long. And he acknowledges, or he talks about how the kind of hypocrisy and cover up that was going on in the church and in the schools, about how the priests and nuns and um, the abuse that was going on was all sort of hidden and covered over, or overlooked, ignored, because of this perception that because these people had this sort of special or high status or prestige in the church, that they were infallible, meaning that they were above or beyond guilt or responsibility for their actions. Whatever they did was right or moral. So if you don't know what the word infallible means, it's an important one that I think you should look up. But it's a sense of that they are, no matter what they do, they're always in the right, or they're morally just, because they took this oath and made this promise to the church. So certain people of like priests or nuns or brothers belong to a special order, and they were considered to be infallible, and they were respected with unshakable reverence. And then he says he acknowledges that even his parents believe that, that certain, you know, people of the Catholic, of a certain order of society were infallible and above the law, basically, in what they did. Augie characterizes his parents as religious fanatics, and he says they naturally believed that whatever was done to us, if we were properly disciplined, was for our own spiritual good. So if Augie's parents thought that way, that means, you know, a lot of society also thought that way at this time, that, you know, these authority figures at the schools, in the churches, were justified in what they were doing, or they were doing it for the children's good rather than for their own selfish means. Um, so we can get the sense of why this was going on and why it was never punished or revealed at the time that it was occurring. So it's been, you know, it hasn't been until like 2008 that there's been sort of a the truth has sort of emerged, and it's been widely recognized in Canada what really happened here. So that tells us how important Augie's story is.